43-year-old Jean Domenico was way too positive and upbeat of a person to complain about her life. In fact, optimism, kindness, and generosity, all those were just some of the words that family and friends used to describe Jean. And those qualities were so obvious in Jean's infectious smile, laughing blue eyes, and warm manner that even total strangers who exchanged just a few words with Jean always left those encounters knowing they'd met a very special kind of person. So, when Jean's coworkers passed by her desk at Oxford Health Plans on that hot New England morning in 2003, no one would have suspected that behind Jean's usual smile and cheerful greeting, Jean had been feeling anything but happy and calm. It was Wednesday, August 6th, and the day was shaping up to be one of the hottest on record in Nashua, New Hampshire, where Jean lived with her 2 teenage children. And when Jean had left her house at 7:45 a.m. that morning, she had spent the 30-minute drive to work going over and over in her mind the events of the last 5 days. Even inside of her air-conditioned car, where she felt comfortable and in control of her surroundings, Jean kept wondering if the decision she had come to on Monday, 2 days earlier, was the right decision, or whether it would just cause even more problems for her and her kids. As a single mom who had ended an abusive marriage 4 years earlier, Jean was no stranger to family drama and the strain of financial hardship, and Jean had always chosen to meet those challenges head-on. After leaving the children's father, Anthony Kazinskis, back in 1999, Jean began working 2 to 3 different jobs at once to put food on the table of their small home in one of Nashua's more modest neighborhoods. Even now, with her full-time job at Oxford Health Plans, Jean still worked a part-time shift at a local convenience store. But despite how busy she was, Jean's primary focus had always been her son, Charlie, now 14 years old, and her daughter, Nicole, who had just turned 16 2 months earlier. The 3 of them had always been very close, and now, aside from still sharing their father's last name, Charlie and Nicole spent almost all their time with their mom. And no matter how crazy her schedule was, Jean had always made sure that both children were well looked after when she was at work, and that the neighbors always kept an eye out for her ex-husband. Not only did Anthony owe Jean $11,000 in unpaid child support, but also Jean wanted to guard against the possibility that Anthony would show up unannounced and uninvited at the house when she was not there. But the turmoil Jean was feeling on this particular morning had nothing to do with Anthony or money or anything else that Jean felt like she could fix through hard work and good parenting, 2 things that came naturally to Jean. In fact, it had been Jean's efforts over the last 2 years to help guide Nicole through a difficult adolescence that had seemed to backfire in ways that Jean had just never expected. Driving along the familiar route to work, Jean thought back to Nicole just before she turned 14 and when their lives had seemed a lot simpler. While still in middle school, Nicole had been an outstanding student whose natural shyness had not stopped her from joining the school chorus and bubbling over at home with news about what she was doing and reading. And when Jean had heard other moms talk about the arguments or fights they had with their teenage daughters, Jean had just felt grateful that she and Nicole had always gotten along so well and had always enjoyed doing things and going places together. But when Nicole turned 14 and headed into high school, her shyness turned into awkwardness and intense self-consciousness about her weight and looks. Jean had been heartbroken the evening she found Nicole sitting on the bed in her tiny upstairs room using scissors to cut pictures of herself into pieces, and hearing Nicole describe herself as fat and ugly. After that, it wasn't long before Nicole, who had also dropped out of the school chorus, became the target of bullying. Driving along Interstate 293, Jean gripped the steering wheel more tightly, remembering one incident when a group of girls pulled Nicole's pants down to her ankles, leaving Nicole fully exposed from the waist down to laughter and stares from surrounding students. Jean had gone straight to the school principal when she heard about the incident, but that had not stopped the whispering and teasing. And then, just when Nicole seemed to be sinking into depression, the shy 14-year-old with low self-esteem had met 17-year-old Billy Sullivan in an online chat room. Billy lived 100 miles away in Willimantic, Connecticut, but the popular internet technology called Instant Messenger had allowed the 2 of them to form a close and personal relationship long before they actually ever met in person. And at first, it took Jean a while to connect the improvement in Nicole's mood and confidence to the increasing amount of time Nicole had started spending on the internet. And Jean certainly didn't know that within just 5 days of their virtual meeting, Billy and Nicole had already declared their undying love for one another. It was only when Jean's phone bill blew up with long-distance phone charges for calls from their home at 6 Dumaine Avenue in Nashua, New Hampshire, to a number more than 2 hours south in Connecticut that Jean realized that Nicole had found her first real boyfriend. But what Jean just could not have expected, given the physical distance between Nicole and Billy, was how seriously Nicole and Billy would begin to take their relationship. And when Jean had finally relented and agreed to drive Nicole to Connecticut so Nicole could actually meet Billy for the first time, Jean was certainly not prepared for how hysterical Nicole became when the 8-hour supervised visit ended and Nicole and Jean turned north and headed home to New Hampshire. On one hand, Jean knew that what she was seeing in Nicole was the kind of drama and intensity that only a teenager could bring to first love, and that eventually the relationship would probably play itself out. Especially since Nicole had confided that Billy, for all his declarations of love for Nicole, had at least one other girlfriend, also Nicole's age. And when Nicole and Billy argued, Billy had let it drop that he'd been, quote, forced, his word, to seek comfort with that other girlfriend. On the other hand, Jean also knew that it was just not possible for her to control the feelings and actions of these two young people. And if all Jean did was say no to Nicole and point out flaws in her relationship with Billy, then chances were good that it would be Jean who Nicole would reject, not Billy. So, when Billy had arrived, unannounced and uninvited, at Jean's house that previous Friday, August 1st, Jean had not been pleased, but she had also, reluctantly, allowed him to stay. As Billy explained to Jean, he'd been given a vacation from his job as a line cook at the local McDonald's near his house in Willimantic, and since he'd also just recently gotten his driver's license and a car of his own, he'd wanted to surprise Nicole with an extended visit. Over the entire 15 months that the two had been together, they'd only actually seen one another in person 4 or 5 times, and never for more than just a few days. In agreeing to the visit, Jean had reasoned that at least this way, she would be able to keep a close eye on Nicole and Billy, who were not permitted to spend any time together alone in Nicole's upstairs bedroom. It had not been the most convenient arrangement in the world. Jean's house was a small but traditional Cape house, a center front entrance that led into the living and dining rooms to either side, with the kitchen and 2 small bedrooms towards the back. Nicole's bedroom, with its sloped ceiling, was on the 2nd floor, along with an equally tiny bathroom. Which meant that when Jean's 14-year-old son, Charlie, wasn't staying over with friends, as he often did, there was no spare bedroom for Billy. And Jean had to tiptoe around Billy, sleeping on the downstairs couch when she got up in the morning to start her day and tidy up the kitchen before leaving for one of her 2 jobs. It wasn't that Billy seemed like a bad kid. He had a steady job at McDonald's. He lived with his single mom and his 4 sisters, but he was not a freeloader. It was clear he loved his family and contributed a regular chunk of his hourly wages to help with household expenses. Tall and lanky, with a military-style buzz cut and dark brown eyes and a smattering of teenage pimples that made him look younger than he really was, he was generally polite and handsome. And Jean had to admit that Billy's frequent declarations about how beautiful and smart and talented Nicole was had, at least in the beginning, done a lot to improve her daughter's self-esteem. Still, Jean was glad the visit was coming to an end, several days sooner than Billy and Nicole had planned, so today was the last day that he and Nicole would have together before Billy returned to Willimantic. The last day, Jean would step outside and see Billy's black Chevrolet Cavalier sitting in their driveway. Just walking by the car that morning on her way to her own car, Jean had thought of that incident at dinner on Sunday, 3 days earlier. Wanting to make Billy feel welcome, Jean had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen cooking a big dinner for all of them. Jean had been surprised when Billy had looked over the serving dishes and hot food that covered the table that evening and commented that it had been a while since he'd had a complete meal. When Jean had looked up from her plate, saying, "Really?" Billy had interpreted her comment as a veiled insult directed at Billy's own mother, as though Peg Sullivan were not as good a cook or as good of a mother as Jean herself was. Remembering the exchange now, Jean just shook her head. For her, Billy's hostile reaction had set the tone of the whole week, and now she was just glad the visit with Billy would soon be over. Determined to keep that fact uppermost in her thoughts, By the time Jean had arrived at work, she had regained most of her outward good cheer. She was scheduled to spend the day training a new employee, and that was something Jean enjoyed and looked forward to. She liked making sure that new hires felt comfortable and welcome and competent, and the training and orientation materials she'd be using were already neatly organized on Jean's work desk and computer. So, half an hour later, as Jean looked up to greet the new employee, it would have taken a very close observer to notice the faint lines of strain on Jean's otherwise open and smiling face. And throughout the day, that close observer did walk by Jean's desk several times to smile and say hello, but it wasn't until 4:30 on that Wednesday afternoon that Chris McGowan, Jean's fiancé and fellow Oxford Health Plan's employee, stopped by long enough to have a real conversation with the woman he loved. Ever since Chris had met Jean on his first day of work 2 years ago, Chris had been completely smitten by this outgoing and friendly woman. A confirmed bachelor whose one long-term relationship had ended in the late 1980s, Chris had not been looking to date anyone, any more than Jean had been. By 2000, Chris, a stocky Irishman with dark hair and a wide smile under his dark mustache, had settled into a comfortable 3-bedroom ranch house as well as a comfortable routine. For her part, Jean was still recovering from her divorce the year before, and all her time and attention was focused on her kids and on paying the bills. And any spare time that she did have, Jean had spent it on activities like coaching Charlie's Little League baseball team or joining the parent-teacher organization when the children went to the Birch Hill Elementary School. But while that initial spark of attraction that Chris and Jean felt for one another had not lit an instantaneous bonfire, it had ignited something much longer lasting. Chris understood and respected Jean's devotion to her kids, and he was careful not to intrude on Charlie and Nicole's time with their mom. Even now, Chris rarely stayed over at Jean's house, except on the weekends, and he was more than happy to wait until both Charlie and Nicole had graduated from high school and begun their own lives before he and Jean got married and lived together. To their respective family and friends, Jean and Chris formed that rare couple who seemed deeply and patiently in love with each other. Although they made a point of keeping their interactions at work very businesslike, Chris never tired of making small gestures that showed how much he cared for Jean, like the bouquet of roses he had delivered to her desk that past Monday. Despite how crowded the Domenico house was now with Billy visiting, Jean had asked Chris to spend as much time there as possible over the last 5 days. Chris got along well with both Charlie and Nicole, and Jean felt better about Nicole and Billy spending so much time together if Chris was also able to keep a watchful eye on both of them. So, Chris knew firsthand the stresses Jean had felt that week, and he also knew that just when Jean felt like she really needed all her energy and stamina, she had experienced a few bouts of dizziness and fatigue over the last 2 days that were just not like her. Chris's first thought was that the dizziness had been the result of the highly restrictive diet that Jean had recently started in an effort to lose several pounds that had added a comfortable roundness to her 5'6" frame. And looking down at Jean now, at the end of yet another workday, he wished he could convince her that she was perfect just as she was, and find some way to erase the tiredness he could see in her eyes. Instead, Chris went over the plan they had agreed on for that evening. He would leave work now, head to his house, shower, check his mail, and do a few household chores, grab some clean clothes, and then meet Jean at 6 Dumaine Street at about 7 or 7:30. That would give Jean plenty of time to stop and pick up the pizza she planned to serve for dinner that night and tidy up the house before Chris arrived. But it wasn't until the end of their conversation, when Chris whispered, "I love you," that Jean really switched out of work mode. Standing up suddenly, her eyes bright with affection, Jean put down her papers and pencil and reached up to give Chris a strong, warm hug. And Chris was still thinking about that hug and Jean's reply as he got into his car a few minutes later and headed south from the small town of Hooksett, where Oxford Health Plans was located, to the much larger city of Nashua, where Chris's house was located just a few miles away from Jean's. At times like this, Chris could understand the thrill of togetherness, whether you were a teenager or a middle-aged insurance broker. When Jean had said, "I love you too," Chris felt like he was the luckiest person in the world. True to his word, Chris arrived at Jean's house at 7:15. He'd called her 3 times since leaving his house at 7 to see if there was anything else she wanted him to pick up for dinner. When all 3 calls went to voicemail, Chris assumed that Jean must be out walking the family's two dogs, and so he stopped just long enough to grab a bottle of soda for the kids. But when Chris stepped out of his car, he could see both dogs still outside in the backyard of Jean's house. Thinking that Jean must have just gotten back from her walk, Chris made his way around to the front, he climbed the steps to the welcome mat, and then came to a sudden stop. The front door was slightly ajar, but inside no lights were on, and the house was eerily quiet. When Jean didn't answer his shouted greeting, "Are you in there, honey?" Chris pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. As he did so, it occurred to him that the dogs out back had been behaving strangely, whining and turning in circles, their tails tucked tightly between their back legs. His sense of alarm growing by the second, Chris was so focused on finding Jean that he did not even notice the smashed-up coffee table in the living room or the dark liquid that was splashed across the carpet. It was only when he stepped into the kitchen and his eyes followed the thin beam of light from the open refrigerator door as it slanted down to the linoleum tiles that Chris began to register the full horror of what was in front of him. Jean lay face down on the kitchen floor, her head and shoulders swimming in a thick pool of blood. A moment later, Chris was on his knees next to her, shaking her, gently at first, but then much harder, calling her name over and over again and begging her to please just wake up. When the Nashua Police Department and emergency medical personnel heard the call go out from dispatch reporting a, quote, sudden death in one of the city's quietest neighborhoods, it only took minutes for fire trucks, an ambulance, and police cruisers to pull up outside Jean Domenico's house at 6 Dumaine Avenue. With more than 90,000 residents, Nashua might be the second largest city in New Hampshire, but even in a state with one of the lowest homicide rates in the whole country, murder here in Nashua was very rare. So when Chris had called 911 and described a scene of blood everywhere when he discovered his girlfriend's lifeless body, law enforcement had mobilized all of its local resources, blocking off the entrance to Dumaine Avenue, even to residents, stringing up crime scene tape to hold back the growing crowd of concerned neighbors or curious spectators, and also making sure that Chris McGowan, dazed, disoriented, and covered in blood, did not take a single step without a police officer keeping close watch on him. Chris may have told the 911 dispatcher that it looked to him like Jean had had some sort of terrible accident, maybe fainting and hitting her head on a corner of the stove, but police did not have to wait for emergency medical personnel and later the medical examiner to tell them that this was no accident. In fact, it was just the opposite. Jean had been the victim of the most horrific attack that responding officers and detectives had ever seen. And since Chris was the person who had discovered Jean's body, and he was the boyfriend, always a person of interest in homicide cases, he had instantly become the #1 prime suspect, especially when he had no alibi for the time he claimed to have spent at home by himself after work and before finding Jean's body. As the first of Jean's neighbors began gathering outside to ask police what was happening, Chris was bundled into the back seat of a cruiser and driven to the Nashua Police Department headquarters, where he willingly gave police a DNA sample before being taken into an interrogation room for questioning. Meanwhile, over the next several hours, crime scene techs and law enforcement were able to gather a huge amount of information about what had happened earlier that afternoon and evening at the Domenico residence. Chris, along with neighbors who had a clear view of Jean's property, helped police establish that Jean had arrived home from work that afternoon at about 5:30 p.m., carrying boxes of pizza she had picked up from a restaurant called Chow's. Jean had missed her daughter Nicole and Billy by about an hour. The two teenagers had been spotted at 4:30 p.m. playing tag in the Domenico's big backyard before hopping into Billy's car and heading to a local 7-Eleven convenience store, where Billy's black Cavalier was later seen by an on-duty police officer who had also stopped at the same 7-Eleven. Both Nicole and Chris had called Jean's phone around 7 p.m. without getting an answer. Nicole had called because she wanted to tell her mom not to expect her and Billy for dinner. It was Billy's last day in Nashua, and he and Nicole wanted to spend the time alone. When Nicole had not been able to reach her mom, she'd left a message on Chris's phone letting him know that she and Billy would be going bowling and then shopping at the local mall. The unanswered calls that both Chris and Nicole had made to Jean suggested to law enforcement that by 7 p.m., Jean was most likely already dead. As for the crime scene itself, Jean's attacker seemed to have made very little effort to cover their tracks. Whoever had killed Jean had left behind a partial bloody handprint on the refrigerator, suggesting that they had not worn gloves and may have left other DNA traces inside of the house. Police were also able to determine the kinds of weapons that had been used to kill Jean, even finding a piece of one weapon in the kitchen sink and another weapon that the killer may have dropped outside. As for motives and suspects, initial interviews with Jean's neighbors had already turned up several possible leads. Even though the neighbors gathering outside were all telling police the same thing, that Jean was genuinely and universally liked and even loved by her friends, coworkers, and acquaintances, it wasn't long before Nashua detectives Dennis Linehan and Richard Sprankle had added names other than Chris McGowan to their people of interest list. Neighbors immediately pointed to Jean's ex-husband, Anthony Carancas. Jean had said outright to several friends that she was afraid of him, and police would soon learn that Anthony had a criminal record for threatening a person by firing off a shotgun in their direction. And some neighbors even whispered that police should track down Jean's own son. Charlie had a reputation for hanging out with a bad group of kids and for such violent displays of temper that for a long time, Jean refused to keep any sharp knives in the house for fear that Charlie might attack her or his sister. Shocked by the violence of the scene, Detective Sprankle also wondered if the murder could possibly be related to gang violence, evidence of which had recently begun to surface in downtown Nashua, where certain walls and buildings had been covered with gang-related graffiti. And as Jean's children arrived at the scene, the feeling of shock and tragedy that now hung over the cozy Cape House just kept growing. Portable floodlights had turned the crime scene tape a neon yellow, and through the windows, Jean's neighbors could see the bulky shape of crime scene techs in protective clothing moving from one room to another. Charlie was the first of Jean's children to arrive. Emerging through the crowd outside his family home, he approached police, asking what was going on and where his mother and sister were. After being informed that his mother was dead, uniformed officers seated him inside of a cruiser and drove him to the police station where he waited for the arrival of his father, Anthony Carancas. As Jennifer Ballou watched the scene unfold from her house next door to Jean's, she felt her heart sink at the thought of Charlie's sister, Nicole. Nicole had babysat regularly for Jennifer, and the two had become close. Jennifer knew how difficult the last few years had been for Nicole, and even though Jean and Nicole had argued over Nicole's relationship with Billy, Jennifer also knew how much Nicole relied on and loved her mom. Already in a vulnerable place, Jennifer knew that Nicole's life was about to get much, much harder. By the time Nicole and Billy arrived at the house at about 10:15, Nashua police officers already had 4 suspects awaiting interrogation at the Nashua Police Department. They were also making room for a parade of neighbors who were there to give witness statements, each arriving in a separate police cruiser so no 2 witnesses could compare and possibly change their stories. It wasn't long before Nicole and Billy were also taken down to the station. With round, dark eyes, Nicole had stared at the house where she lived and where she had just been playing tag in the backyard 6 hours earlier. Nicole barely seemed to register Billy's quick kiss on her lips. A few minutes later, and she was sliding into the cool interior of a black and white cruiser headed to the Nashua police station 10 minutes to the south. After Nicole left, Billy remained at the scene with one of the police detectives. When Billy was young, his family's home had caught fire, and ever since then, as he told the investigator, he'd reacted with a lot of anxiety to the sound and sight of the flashing blue and red lights on emergency vehicles. Even though Billy did not know Nicole's family that well, as he and the detective chatted, Billy immediately agreed to help the police with their investigation, and by 10:30 p.m., he was happy to get away from the commotion and flashing lights at Nicole's house. He too was making the short trip south to a police station that now seemed to be overflowing with witnesses and suspects. For police detectives Linehan and Sprankle, it was a very busy night. Their main focus was on the interrogation of Jean's fiancé and her ex-husband, Anthony. Distracted and upset by the sight and feel of Jean's blood all over his bare arms, hands, and knees, as well as the patches of her blood that stained his shirt and shorts, Chris seemed to have a hard time concentrating on the questions, let alone accepting the fact that Jean had been murdered. Jean's ex-husband had given police permission to question Nicole and Charlie. Anthony himself was civil without being overly helpful. But once police had confirmed Anthony's alibi, they realized he did not seem to have any useful information anyway, and so from then on, he was present at the station only as the legal guardian of his two now motherless children. But even though investigators had ruled out Anthony as Jean's killer, they already knew they were making progress. Given the amount of physical evidence from the crime scene and leads from witness statements and their interview with Chris, they were confident that it would only be a matter of time and getting the forensics and autopsy reports before they identified Jean's killer. Still, they never expected that the breakthrough they were looking for would come so early in their investigation. And when the tip did come in, it came from a witness, not from a suspect. As Detective Linehan was out in the hallway looking for a larger room where Billy could wait for someone to take his statement, another detective, Mark Schaff, had noticed something interesting during the interview he was conducting with one of the witnesses. It was just a slip of paper, but it might be important. After describing his find to Detective Linehan, both investigators went still for just a moment. The air conditioning in the station was broken, and the heat from the day had been trapped inside, making everyone feel sticky and uncomfortable. Pulling his collar a bit looser, Detective Linehan decided this information was significant enough that he needed to follow up on it in person. By the time the sun rose 5 hours later on Thursday, August 7th, what the veteran detective was about to discover would become front-page headlines for weeks to come. Based on that conversation and follow-up interviews with other witnesses, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Jean Domenico on the evening of Wednesday, August 6, 2003, inside her home at 6 Dumaine Avenue. After arriving home from work at about 5:30, Jean rolled right into her usual routine, letting the dogs out to do their business in the backyard, collecting and sorting the mail, checking phone messages, and tidying up the house. By the time she sat down to relax on the living room sofa, Jean was more than ready to spend a few minutes doing nothing more than enjoying the smell of pizza wafting up from the boxes on the kitchen table. After this past week, when the house had felt so crowded with people and teenage emotions, she welcomed the quiet before Chris and eventually Nicole, Billy, and Charlie arrived for dinner. So, when Jean heard the front door open a few minutes later, she looked at her watch in surprise. Chris would not be here for another hour, and it seemed early for the kids to be home, and Jean's surprise only intensified when she looked up and recognized her visitor. While Jean had been settling herself on the sofa, her killer had been cutting through the parking lot off Deerwood Drive behind Jean's house. Once Jean's backyard was in sight, the killer hesitated, but only for a moment. The plan was in motion, and there was no real doubts about what had to be done. By the time the killer had walked along the side of the backyard and cut across the front yard to the front steps, the killer felt committed and ready. Flinging open the door, the killer stepped inside. After saying hello to a startled Jean, the killer continued walking past her into Charlie's first-floor bedroom. Reaching behind the door of that bedroom, the killer pulled out an aluminum baseball bat. Closing the door, the killer then walked back out to the kitchen, where Jean was now standing next to the stove, a puzzled look on her face. Stepping toward the open entrance from the kitchen into the living room, the killer stopped and, turning to face Jean, lifted the bat and gave it an experimental swing. "I hate the Yankees," the killer said, referring to New York's Major League Baseball team. At this, Jean, who loved baseball, relaxed a little and went back to sitting on the couch and offering a few observations about recent sports news. It wasn't until the cordless phone on the small table next to the sofa rang and the killer immediately reached over Jean to answer it that time suddenly seemed to rush forward in a blur. After just a moment of listening to the conversation, Jean was raising her voice in anger. And as she turned to walk into the kitchen, thinking that any kind of movement might help her collect herself after recognizing the caller on the other end of the line, the killer suddenly lunged forward toward Jean. Then the killer swung the baseball bat in the direction of Jean's head. But instead of delivering a single blow that would stun Jean or crush her skull, the bat missed Jean's head. Instead, it hit her straight across her back and sent her staggering against the wall. Shocked and hurt, Jean righted herself and turned to look back. But even as she did so, her attacker swung the bat a second time. And this time, the bat hit Jean squarely on the back of her head, causing what the medical examiner would later describe as a large split in the bone of her skull. Still, not only did Jean stay on her feet, she fought back. A few seconds later, and the two of them had crashed onto the glass coffee table in the living room, snapping the wooden legs and showering the carpet with shattered glass. Despite her injuries, Jean would break free from her attacker 2 more times before her killer managed to dodge past her into the kitchen and grab a knife from the butcher block on Jean's counter. Rounding again on Jean, the killer struck. The first blow to Jean's upper right shoulder was so hard that the knife blade broke off from the wooden handle. Dropping the handle onto the floor, the killer reached again for the butcher block. Grabbing a second knife, the killer stabbed Jean twice in the throat before dropping that knife onto the kitchen floor. But as her attacker started to turn away, Jean picked the knife up and once again pushed herself to her feet. Shocked, her attacker watched as Jean tried to run towards them before slipping and falling in her own blood. As she fell, Jean's head bumped almost gently against her killer's side before hitting the plexiglass in the back door with enough force to push the panel completely out of its frame. Grabbing a third knife, Jean's killer straddled her fallen body and began stabbing, delivering more than a total of 40 blows to Jean's head, neck, back, arms, and hands before finally standing and looking down at her dark, blood-soaked hair and profile. Pausing before going into the bathroom to clean up, the killer listened as Jean struggled to breathe before speaking her final words. "Okay," she whispered, "I'm done." About 15 minutes after the killer had left the house, the back door at 6 Dumaine Avenue opened again. But this time, the visitor had to push hard enough to move Jean's body out of the way in order to enter the house. Once inside, the visitor looked down at the single mother of 2 lying in a pool of blood, and then very casually and carefully stepped over the body. Cleaning up the scene would be difficult, but the important thing was to avoid leaving footprints. So, picking their way through the splashes of blood that seemed to cover everything, not only the floors from the kitchen out through the living room, but also the walls and even the ceiling. The visitor was soon hard at work, scrubbing away handprints, gathering up the baseball bat and knives, and bundling everything, including bloody clothes the killer had left in the bathroom, inside a jacket. And then, straightening up and pushing her long dark hair out of her face, Jean Domenico's 16-year-old daughter, Nicole, gave a final look around the house. The smell of the pizzas on the kitchen table lost in the coppery scent of her mother's blood. Moving with the same care she had used coming into the house, Nicole once again stepped over her mother's body, and then, with a sigh of relief, Nicole closed the kitchen door behind her. Billy had done his part. He had kept his promise to Nicole that he would kill her mother so he and Nicole could be together for the rest of their lives, and now Nicole had done her part too. She had gone back to the house, cleaned up Billy's mess, and picked up the inhaler he needed to control his asthma. Earlier, when Billy had returned to the lot at the nearby 7-Eleven convenience store after killing Jean, Nicole had been waiting for him, reading a teen magazine she enjoyed while leaning against the hood of his black Chevy Cavalier. Nicole had been surprised by how much blood Billy still had on him, even after he had run upstairs before leaving the house to get a clean shirt out of the suitcase he had left in her bedroom. Nicole was also surprised at how angry and agitated Billy seemed. She'd known almost as soon as she called her home number, maybe 30 minutes earlier, and Billy had answered the phone, that her mother was still alive, because Nicole could hear her mother's voice in the background asking Billy if he was speaking to Nicole, and then hearing her mom plead directly with Nicole, asking her to please just come home. Nicole had had to shout at Billy to just do it, get it done, because how else would the two of them be able to start a life together unless Nicole's mother was dead? And Nicole had also known that her call to Billy had just made him upset. Still, it surprised her that once her mother was gone, that this reunion with Billy in the 7-Eleven parking lot wasn't more romantic and satisfying. And seeing all that blood on Billy, Nicole didn't really want to go back to the house, but Billy had made her, saying that cleaning up the murder scene had been Nicole's part of the bargain. It had been very hard stepping over her mother's body and not even being completely sure her mom was actually dead yet, but Nicole had done it. And then the two of them, Billy and Nicole, had driven to the Pheasant Lane Mall so Billy could clean up and get more clean clothes, and so they could get rid of the baseball bat, the knives, and those bloody clothes by dumping them at the deserted wooded edge of Overlook Golf Course located one town over. But once Nicole and Billy went back to the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, thinking they had committed the perfect crime and set up perfect alibis for themselves, everything started to fall apart. Nicole just had no way of knowing that later that night they would both be questioned by police and that some detective would notice the receipt for the new clothes Billy was wearing sticking out of Nicole's shirt pocket. And once that detective had started asking Nicole all kinds of questions about where she and Billy had been that afternoon and evening, it was impossible to keep all the lies straight. And soon the detective was talking to another detective who went and talked to Billy, and pretty soon the story Nicole told wasn't matching the story Billy was telling. And that's when Nicole just broke down in tears and told the detective everything that happened. Except that in Nicole's mind, even though it had been her idea to kill her mother, it was all Billy's fault because he was the one who actually did the killing. It would turn out that 3 days into Billy's visit to 6 Dumaine Avenue, Jean was so alarmed at the intensity of the relationship between Billy and Nicole that she told the two teenagers that Billy would need to end his visit early. She wanted him gone first thing in the morning on Thursday, August 7th. Jean also made it clear to Nicole that Jean was not interested in having Billy come visit again, or in letting Nicole go visit Billy. And after Billy's outburst at Jean during that family dinner on Sunday when Billy accused Jean of insulting Billy's mother, Jean had also begun to suspect that not only was Billy manipulating Nicole, he also had serious anger issues. What Jean had no way of knowing was just how correct those suspicions were. Ever since the age of 5, Billy had shown signs of depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder, a mental health condition that causes major mood swings. Billy had also been hospitalized at least 5 times for psychiatric problems, including an episode in which he had attacked his mother with a baseball bat. The agitation that police noticed in Billy when he and Nicole appeared at the crime scene on the night of August 6th may have been triggered by the bad memories he associated with flashing emergency lights, but it was also a physical symptom that indicated he was not taking the medications prescribed to treat his mental illness. In the 15 months since Nicole had met Billy online, Nicole and Billy had held a mock wedding ceremony, and by late 2002 had begun referring to one another as husband and wife and Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan. They also had both written letters to Jean asking that she allow Nicole to move to Connecticut and live with Billy. And when Jean said no, absolutely not, Nicole and Billy started talking about other ways to be together. Running away to another state, or getting Nicole a legal separation from her family. And even though Billy had at least one other girlfriend besides Nicole, he and Nicole made lists of what they would buy for their new apartment and life together. When Jean finally put her foot down and told Nicole and Billy on Monday, August 4th that they needed to end their relationship, the two teenagers would spend the next 3 days conspiring to kill Nicole's mother, the one person who stood between them and their dreams of the life they would spend together. In the early morning hours of August 6th, seated in separate interrogation rooms at the Nashville Police Department, Billy and Nicole each confessed to the brutal murder of Jean Domenico. In all, the life they had dreamed of together had lasted less than 5 hours, and the last time Billy and Nicole kissed or saw each other until their cases went to trial was just outside the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, where Jean's body would remain lying in its pool of drying blood until the next day. The news of Nicole's arrest stunned not only her family, but everyone who had known Jean. But that was not the last of Nicole's revelations. It would turn out that Nicole and her boyfriend had made 4 previous attempts on Jean's life in the days leading up to the murder. First, they had laced her coffee creamer with over-the-counter drugs and then with bleach. Neither attempt at poisoning worked. The drugs caused the episodes of dizziness that Chris would later blame on Jean's restrictive diet. The smell of bleach made Jean throw the creamer away without drinking any of it. The third murder attempt, starting a fire in Jean's bedroom and then locking Jean inside, failed when the flame-retardant mattress in Jean's bedroom would not catch fire. Their fourth attempt to kill Jean, by running a gasoline-soaked length of rope through an outside window into the oil tank and then setting the rope and eventually the oil inside the tank on fire, ended when Chris came out of the house and saw them. Panicking, Nicole threw the rope into a nearby garbage can. By Wednesday afternoon, August 5th, Billy and Nicole had decided to kill Jean with the baseball bat they knew was behind the door of Charlie's bedroom. They would create alibis with the story they told Chris about spending the dinner hour at the local bowling alley, and they also assumed the police would suspect that Jean was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. On March 28, 2005, almost 1.5 years after Jean's murder, Nicole avoided a charge of first-degree murder by pleading guilty to lesser charges of second-degree murder and agreeing to testify against the love of her life, Billy Sullivan. Nicole was sentenced to a minimum of 35 years in prison. 4 months later, on July 15th, after an unsuccessful attempt to plead guilty by reason of insanity, Billy was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. After Jean's murder, Nicole's brother, Charlie, went to live with his father, Anthony Carancas. Birch Elementary School in Nashua, where Jean had once worked as a volunteer, member of the parent-teacher organization, and a teacher's aide, dedicated a granite bench in her honor that stands outside the school's entrance. On May 22, 2004, the city of Nashua renamed one of its Little League baseball fields the Jean Domenico Ballpark. Today's story is called The Carancas Curse. It was a chilly morning on September 15, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Carancas, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground.
The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Carancas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky, but they thought that Carancas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Carancas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Carancas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Carancas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting. And she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Carancas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive. Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Carancas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics. but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Carancas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patients' blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Carancas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Carancas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. Maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Carancas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Carancas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Carancas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Carancas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Ururi sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities, and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Carancas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too, but he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded, and then explained that when the meteorite hit Carancas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment, Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Luisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Luisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Luisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Carancas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Carancas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Carancas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Carancas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Carancas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO.